Alrighty, hello and welcome to the June Archaeology Club meeting. We have Adam from University of Maryland, and he's an assistant professor coming to tell us about archaeology happening right in our backyards in Baltimore. Adam, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Good evening. Let me go ahead and share my screen here, get going. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yep, looking great.
Great. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. I'd like to talk tonight a little bit about my research over the last couple of years and how all these projects intersect and kind of the larger goals for this archaeological work in Baltimore. So the research goals are essentially to document the archaeological heritage of Baltimore, especially West Baltimore and some of the more threatened sites we have within the city. The overall goal is to build awareness of these sites, this archaeological heritage, the rich archaeological heritage in the city, promote its use, and then ultimately its preservation. Okay, one of my research goals academically is looking at specifically the working class history of Baltimore and the history of labor and labor relations in the city. With that, I'll look at the larger scale national networks that Baltimore, even international networks that Baltimore's been involved in, regional networks and local networks. And you can see, hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll see how many of these sites are interrelated. Excuse me. And then lastly, as an archaeologist, my goal is to look at it spatially and materially, looking at expressions of social relations, race, class, ethnicity, and gender, and how these different identities, intersecting identities, played out over time, how they were defined, how others define them, and how people live their lives, essentially. Okay, so I'd like to start with this slide. Excuse me, I'm just moving. There you go. Looking at when we talk about neglected places or places that have not been examined, this, of course, is a place that has been examined. This is, if anybody's been up to Towson, this is the Hampton Mansion, a massive scale mansion that's been preserved. It's now a National Historic Site operated by the Park Service. It's a fairly impressive building, beautiful on the inside, gilded in the inside. But also we start digging deeper as archaeologists do, and we start looking through the history and the material record. We can see another story here. So this is actually from the day books of the Ridgely family, and the Ridgely family actually operated an iron furnace near to the mansion, and the iron furnace generated most of their wealth, their early wealth. But recorded within that day book between 1775 and 1777, under the columns of profit and loss, Ridgely writes that 5 certain servants were killed working at the furnace because of their exertion of their labor. Right, so you see this heritage that's been preserved, the mansion, but you also don't see the other side of the wealth that was generated through essentially working people to death, and how that story is not told. All right, and when we actually look at Baltimore in general, we see 2 different stories. We see the Inner Harbor, we see communities of great wealth, but we also see communities of great poverty. And so one of the questions we have with this research project is recovering the heritage of the whole city, of essentially both cities, and studying that heritage, and so I'm trying to understand why there's this seeming dichotomy within the city. So I'm going to start with the Northampton iron furnace. The site of the location of the furnace on this map is denoted with a blue circle. You can see, based on this geological map, the distribution of iron ores, and it pretty much follows the fall line going up from DC through Baltimore up into Harford County. But the colonists were very aware of this iron ore. In England, the English crown lost access to Swedish iron, so they turned to the colonies to produce iron. And so the production of iron was a very lucrative business. And so the Ridgely family set up shop essentially near Towson, what would become Towson, and began an iron forge and furnace in that location. Okay, and this is another map. This is what the area looks like now. This is just locations of different mines, quarries, limestone quarries and iron quarries. You need limestone, which acts like a flux when you're making iron ore. The furnace is actually in Loch Raven Reservoir, which is right here in the center. But you can see the distribution of these different quarries and why the Ridgely family would want to go there, work there, run their furnace there. One of the benefits in the colonial period is they had a large amount of wood, so they could make charcoal to feed the furnace. You had local quarries nearby, and you also had the supply of labor. So we set out to actually explore what the dimensions of labor were like for those workers. Several of those workers had died. So the Ridgely family employed convicts. They employed indentured servants, some free labor, and slaves from the 1760s up until the 1820s. So our goal was to document what was the history of their life at the furnace. We know that after the Revolution, the Ridgely families exclusively relied on enslaved labor up until the end of the furnace operation in the 1820s. So we went and actually ran an archaeological field school. An archaeological field school through the University of Delaware. And this is kind of the landscape that we were approached with, trying to find buildings that were no longer present above the surface within what the students called the Maryland jungle. Oops. There you go. So to orient us in space, we not only do archaeological research, but historical research. This is an 1843 map called the Barney map of the whole of the Hampton plantation, which include the iron furnace. And you can see different features on this map. The tree line, the different roads, different streams, different buildings. I'll zoom in here. And you can see this is 1843. So this is after the furnace is no longer in operation. But you can see the old furnace marked here. You can see where my cursor is. The old coal house. You can see dwelling, barn, hay barracks. You can see the old raceway, which fed to the furnace's water wheel. So we had a rough idea of what some of the buildings that were still present in 1843 when the furnace essentially becomes a farm. One of the other things we use is called LiDAR, which essentially is a aerial survey technique where light is emitted from a drone or a plane, and so many measurements are taken of elevation. You can get a very, very detailed elevation model, and you can compare minute changes in elevation to see features that would be harder to see with the naked eye. So this is a LiDAR, detail of a LiDAR image from the furnace. And you can see some of the items we located through this LiDAR detail. So you can see part of a bank barn, see different foundations and wells, as well as many different road traces, as well as what was known as the coal house. And what we did essentially was take that LiDAR data and match it up to the 1843 Barney map. And what that allowed us to do was locate the furnace in space on a current aerial image. You can kind of see the superimposed 1843 Barney map georeferenced over a modern day aerial. We also saw was essentially this massive industrial landscape. Ridgely's were producing iron for kettles, for stovebacks. During the Revolution, they were making cannonballs and cannon. So there's a massive operation here. You can see with the LiDAR, which essentially looks through the tree canopy, you can see a quarry, you can see a borrow pit or quarry, you can see essentially the raceway, the raceway for the water wheel that fed the water wheel further down, and as well as remains of the dam. So we use this to try and pierce through that jungle and understand what the landscape looked like. What was the landscape the workers were encountering and working in. But when we actually got onto that essentially peninsula going into the Lock Raven Reservoir, we were able to find elements of the dam. You can see the earthen dam that still remains, a portion of it. Remnants of the farm. Base of a silo. This was a later farm that operated until the 1920s. In the 1920s, the furnace was actually inundated by water when Lock Raven Reservoir was created. This is actually the furnace in the middle of the reservoir. This is what was known as the bridge house. The image on the right, which was a platform that went out to the furnace so they could feed the furnace from the top. And then in the course of our work, we found numerous outbuildings. This was one of the farm outbuildings. All right, so now we oriented ourselves within space. We went and actually did a series of tests. So we did a series of shell test pits, which are our excavations about the size of slightly bigger than a shovel. That is done stratigraphically. So we record different soil layers, we record the element, everything within those soil layers, and keep artifacts separate by soil layers. So it's a quick way of surveying a larger area. So we essentially surveyed an area around this foundation walls and cellar hole to try and see if we could locate any buildings that workers may have been living in. And we also put in a series of test units, excavation units. So this is kind of what we encountered. This is towards the end of the field school, which was operated fall of 2019. You can see some remnants of the foundation walls, as well as this large cellar hole that they're working in. So we were able to trace with Northampton, we were able to trace some of, find some of the buildings that workers may have been living in. We were only there for essentially, I believe, 14 days total. We were able to reconstruct the landscape, but more work needs to be done in this area to kind of locate some of the more buildings that are harder to show up on the LiDAR. Log buildings where enslaved individuals or convicts or the indentured servants may have been living in. But all of these projects connect together, and that's kind of what I wanted to show with this presentation. So on this map, you can see Joppa. You can see Joppa, which I'll be talking about next. You also see Northampton Furnace, right? So if you follow the gunpowder down, you get towards Joppa, right? So what we have actually, the next project, Joppa, which is a colonial port town. The history is connected because Northampton was an iron furnace. It was producing, they clear cut a lot of forest. There's a lot of erosion. That erosion actually went downstream, and Joppa, which was a colonial port, eventually silts in the 1760s. So the operation of the furnace actually, and agriculture as well, led to Joppa eventually failing as a port. You can see from this 1945 aerial, you can see that the amount of siltation that essentially blocked Joppa off from its ability to have ocean-going vessels come in. So Joppa town was a port. It was also the county seat of Baltimore County from I might get this wrong, 1712 to 1768, I believe. Eventually, it was in competition with Baltimore town, and Baltimore town won out. And once Joppa town silted in and also lost the county seat status, the town began to fade. So our research was trying to document this town, which is basically non-extant on the landscape anymore. And what we turned once again to try to orient ourselves in space was the 1725 plat of Joppa town. And it shows kind of the core of the town. So you see Church Street, you see the courthouse, See the old prison, there's a new prison, you see St. John's Parish Church. So this would have been the center of commerce, of business. You know, people would come to Joppa to have their court case heard, to transact and to have business transactions, to go to one of the inns, going to one of the taverns, going to the docks to have items shipped or receive shipments from England. So we believe, I believe in in the early part of the 18th century, there's at least 40 buildings here in addition to the civic and religious buildings. You can kind of see these different lots that were laid out along these different Church Street, Court Street, Low Street, High Street. One of the also things we were trying to understand is how has this landscape changed over time? So in the 1960s, Joppa's proximity to Baltimore actually impacted it because it became essentially a suburb of Baltimore. There were plans to redevelop it as essentially a waterfront community. So you see massive dredging, you see the creation of these different lots with all having water access and massive movements of dirt. So by 1960s, this essentially becomes a suburb of Baltimore. Its rural nature changes. You can see some of the tenant houses that were still extant, and then also the Rumsey Mansion, which is the only building left from Joppa. So one of the things we did was, before we went, in the middle of going out and doing this work, we actually had geophysical testing done to try and locate what was below the surface. And you can kind of see some of this is just like a channel, but this would have been the original shoreline. And you can kind of see the remains of the original church here, and then here's the Rumsey Mansion. Part of that geophysical work was done by the Maryland Historical Trust. They were kind enough to come out and use ground penetrating radar and magnetometry to look for buried structures. This is one of the maps they produced. You can kind of see you can see the church foundation, which we knew was extant. You can see a modern utility line. You can see a gravel road. Part of the remains, architectural remains of the tenant farm, as well as some historic road traces here. But what this failed to do, unfortunately, was locate any of the other structures present, which would have been present in this the core of Joppa. Through archaeological field schools through the University of Maryland over the last 2 summers, we were able to locate several buildings. And this is giving you an example. This is from August of 2021. We excavated in front of the Rumsey Mansion. You can see all of these layers of fill with material from the late 18th to early 20th century, going down to what is in the last couple of courses of a brick foundation and actually the brick cellar floor. So this building, we were only able to get this picture of this one little unit of this building, but this building is roughly in the location of the courthouse. One of the reasons we're looking at Joppa is kind of understand colonial life, basically on the verge of the revolution. So how did ideas of slavery, how did ideas of independence, different social relations, different identities, how did those form? And so this is really the beginning of trying to understand what's preserved in Joppa, what do we have, and what can we study. Now, kind of moving on to back to Baltimore proper, looking at history and looking at what is prioritized, what kind of history is prioritized. So I lead with essentially looking at the fact that we have whole neighborhoods, whole blocks, excuse me, that have been demolished, and no archaeology done, no assessment of that history. All right, and that's kind of because we view some areas of Baltimore as problematic, almost like a disease that has to be removed. Excuse me. So one of the goals for this project is to look at these areas that have been neglected and kind of prioritize neighborhoods blocks that have been slated for demolition or have been demolished, and trying to recover that history, especially the more marginalized areas of the city. So here are several sites that I've worked on, or I've worked on with other individuals in West Baltimore. So these are the sites kind of we've worked in the last 10 years or so. Excuse me. So this was actually done through the ASM through Dave Gatsby. They looked at Lafayette Square, which is in West Baltimore, and it was a fashionable Victorian square which got converted during the Civil War into an encampment for Union soldiers. And this is what the encampment looked like. And so one of the projects was to do a very brief survey of the park and see if any remnants of the camp still exist. And through shovel test pits and units, we were able to recover some material from that period. And you can see one of these Maryland button right here. Excuse me. Right on Lafayette Square on the southeast corner is another building. This is the Sellers Mansion. This is kind of what it looked like in 2018. It looks even worse now, but this is what it looked like in the 1860s. So Matthew Sellers came up from the south. He was a plantation owner. He came up and he built this grandiose, very large mansion, marble-clad mansion, and kind of cemented his his status. And in Baltimore, decided to live pretty much on the hill, in a very fashionable neighborhood. This building was supposed to be renovated in 2018. The Commission for Historic and Architectural Preservation asked us to come and essentially work as volunteers and do the archaeological work prior to renovation of the building, since this building is on the Baltimore City's landmark list. This is what the building looked like. On the bird's eye view, you can see the mansion itself. You can see Lafayette Square. And this is really essentially the edge of the city at this period of time. And you see there's a carriage house. So one of the things we were interested in is understanding not just the Sellers family, but also the people who worked for the Sellers family, the servants of the Sellers family. So we knew, based on this insurance map, that there was another outbuilding, what they call the nursery building, a 3-story building, and also a spite wall. So when the Sellers family built the mansion, they also eventually went on a tour of Europe. And when they came back, they were shocked to find that somebody built a home on the lot adjacent to theirs. And in response, Matthew Sellers builds this 40-foot high spite wall to block the neighbor's view of his property, and attached to it is this large nursery building. So one of our goals was to find, since this area is going to be impacted by the renovation work, to find this building and see if there was any traces of the servants of the Sellers family in this building, or the foundation of this building. So in 2018, we set out, did our archaeological survey, and you can see it's not a lot of real estate essentially left of this property. We had volunteers come out, excuse me, and test the north yard and the east yard. Found traces of a brick walkway dating to the early history of the property, as well as a lot of architectural debris. We also, like I said, we targeted the nursery building, and we found essentially the curved front of the nursery building. Here's the foundation. And this was all done over a series of weekends with volunteers spanning from August to, I think, December. So it was very warm when we started and very cold when we ended here. It was essentially when we had volunteers and time on the weekends. But one of the cool things, so we found this structure the nursery structure. We found material inside and outside, but we found throughout the yard as well. We found material dating to the seller's occupation. So marbles, bone button. You have a seltzer bottle. You have a ginger beer bottle. You have different ceramics, a champagne bottle, some doll parts, as well as, I know this is an awful picture and I apologize, several medicine bottles as well. So it's hard to differentiate from our limited survey what pertains to the seller's family or the people working for the seller's family. We haven't been able to discern that from or separate out the material that way yet. What we also found, which I found really, really interesting, was the seller's occupation, the post-seller's occupation. So the last of the seller's family lives in the property in the 1950s. Then it goes through a series of owners and used as a community center, used for different community functions, used by the church, and then ultimately becomes vacant. But we found evidence of that later history, paddleball, a little cupcake stopper from a previous renovation attempt, decorative pond pebble, chair leg, hook, fishing hook, as well as a battleship peg, which, if you know Battleship, the red is a hit, which is kind of exciting. So we found evidence of the post-seller's occupation, and also record some of the history of the neighborhood of people who remember the house. They don't remember anything about the sellers, but they remember that this is the house that they would play in the yard, or they'd sit on the steps and watch parades go by, or different events in the park. So this building had meaning to the people, to the neighborhood, even though it didn't have the connection to the seller's family anymore. Also, speaking to this notion of two different cities, one of the things we encountered, obviously, is in West Baltimore, there's a high poverty rate and there's a problem with drugs, and so this building is a very large building. It shields people from view. So there's a lot of illicit drugs within the first layer. So this was always a hazard when digging through, running into these different needles, etc. And this is kind of what else we found, which was really interesting, was the seller's mansion. And this is an early 19th century map of Baltimore. We can see these different estates. And I'll talk about Edward Ireland's building in just a little bit, but the seller's family was on a part of a larger estate. And actually through our excavation work, we were able to recover even earlier, early 19th, early 18th, later 18th century deposits in the backyard, which was probably associated with one of these earlier estates on the fringes, essentially on the fringes of Baltimore town. Another work, this was actually done with Stephen Brett and I at the University of Maryland, was to explore the back of the Irish Shrine, which is 1912 and 1914 Lemon Street. These buildings are actually slated for demolition and were saved at the last minute, and now they've become essentially a museum for the Irish heritage within Baltimore. We were able to test in the backyard of two of these properties. We found a mix of historic material dating from the 1840s, when these buildings were built, up until really the beginning of the 20th century. And you can see some of this material laid out. This is probably part of a privy that had been partially disturbed. You can see these different ceramics and glasswares in the lab waiting for analysis. And so what we had was a nice mix of essentially working class German and Irish families who lived in these two properties during the 19th and early 20th century. One of the other, so we've continued our work in West Baltimore, and one of the things we've tried to prioritize is, like I said, areas and populations that have been marginalized, especially in terms of archaeological research. And West Baltimore, which was a vibrant African-American community, has not seen any very limited archaeological research. So we've been trying to examine properties that are threatened within West Baltimore. One of the properties we looked at was being renovated by Black Women Build, which is a nonprofit run by Shelley Halstead, where she trains African-American women primarily to renovate properties and essentially take these vacant buildings that were going to be demolished, renovate them, and sell them for affordable housing. Several of these women who have worked on these properties now are homeowners. So she's providing jobs as well as affordable home ownership in these communities. Oops, I went backwards. Yep. So we actually went, I asked Shelley if we could come to one of her buildings that she was currently renovating, and before she renovated the backyard, if we could test. So we started with 1905 Edding Street. This is the 18 at the bottom left-hand corner, the 1869 plan view map, or excuse me, bird's eye map. And you can see that was not developed at that time. By the late 1880s, these alley houses have been developed. It was a very small homes, primarily African-American working class, almost exclusively African-American working class. And this is 1905 Edding Street where we started. This is what the building looked like when Shelley bought it. And they've since renovated it. They've gutted the inside, put new floors in. And this is the essentially postage stamp backyard that we wanted to examine. Why do we want to look at the backyard? Backyard's pretty much your only space you have outside the house, besides the front steps. But what's going to be in your backyard? Trash deposits, potentially a privy, stuff that we can examine that might collect material culture. We could examine to understand the lives of the people in the house. So in the fall of 2021, no, not 20. Yep. Winter and spring, excuse me. We examined the backyard. You can see these are students from Coppin State, Morgan State, University of Delaware, University of Maryland, as well as faculty members from Goucher College, Coppin State, all working to look in this backyard. And of course, police came. In this yard, 1905, we did research of who lived in the property, and we found that the woman who lived in this property from essentially 1900 through the 1940s was Sarah McGill, and different relations of hers lived with her. She possibly had 3 kids who I believe had all passed on at an early age. You can kind of see we had a volunteer tease out the different family relationships of the McGill family. Sarah McGill also had several boarders. It was common to have rent rooms, even though these buildings were so small, to rent rooms to make ends meet. So testing in 1905 Edding Street in the backyard. Some of these pictures have gotten a little blurry, but you can see we encountered numerous utility lines, numerous fill layers. This backyard was very busy throughout its history. And then at the very bottom, layers of coal ash. Well, this picture got really blurry, so I apologize. But you can see the kind of the mixed different layers that were filled with different material culture, as well as this large coal ash deposit. Just give you a scale of the excavation. You don't have a lot of room to work with. This is another utility line. You can see this massive amount of coal ash at the bottom. So we don't know if this yard area, this was a deposit during occupation, but it seems more or less that it's probably a deposit of coal ash before the building was even built, perhaps to actually level the ground. One of the reasons for doing this project was to try and generate interest and actually employ local students in this work. And we were able to get a grant from Preservation Maryland to do that, to help fund some of these students in terms of the field work as well as the analysis of this material. And some of the material we found, wealth of, once again, working class, diet, ceramics for dining, bottles, a few personal items, different faunal bones, architectural material. as well as some more personal items, some doll parts. And here's some more items that have been cleaned up. Different medicine bottles, ceramics, pipes. You see a large cow bone here, as well as inkwell. This is, yeah, let me go back. But one of the neat things we found on this property was large amount of writing implements and material culture associated with writing. So we found actually a piece of slate with some letters etched into it. So obviously in this household, reading and writing was highly valued and prioritized, which kind of speaks to just life in the in 1905 Enning Street and the priorities of the family, even though this group is essentially, highly marginalized, being Black and the working class within Baltimore. We were able to, Shelley Halstick gave me a call and said they were going to renovate 1904 and 1906 Enning Street. And so we were able to test there over a very short period of time, looking once again for a privy. We didn't find the privy in 1905, but we actually did locate it in 1904. And it was a shared privy with 1906. So we excavated the privy, all 10 feet of the privy, and at the very bottom of the privy, so privy being an outhouse where not only did you relieve yourself, but you also deposited your trash. We found this mix of material, that waterlogged material. So because it had been waterlogged, the leather, the wood hadn't decayed and remained essentially preserved. For us, we were able to recover this material, bring it back to the lab, wash it off. But then we were stuck with a dilemma because we have this material that has to stay wet, because if it dries out, it's going to fall apart. So we were able to get some conservators from the University of Delaware and their students to work on preserving some of these different clothespins and different wood items. You can see some on the right-hand side, some shoe soles. There's actually a ball, different items that needed careful conservation work. This was great because this layer, normally with an outhouse, you have over time it gets filled. You either have to move to a different spot, which you don't have that many spots in these yards, and so that's small, or it gets cleaned out periodically. So this privy was being cleaned out periodically, but they weren't cleaning it all the way. So there was a layer at the bottom that wasn't getting cleaned out. So what we have here is kind of a nice slice of probably the really late 19th century, early 20th century residents and some of the material culture they had, from their food remains to their dishes, to their shoes, to their clothespins, different rags, different clothing items that got deposited in this pit. So this is a great picture of people living 1904 and 1906 Enning Street, which were renters, and with the property had a very high turnover rate. But for us, we were able to record an element of their life through that material culture, which has been absent, especially through the historical records. We also were able to, based on this work, we were contacted to do essentially the contract archaeology, the compliance archaeology for the Upton mansion. The Upton mansion is a Greek revival mansion built in the 1830s. It's now derelict, but there's plans for the effort charities which archives the Arthur newspaper, to come and renovate it and make it their headquarters and archive. With that, they're going to renovate the property, and they're going to build a larger building in the back, while still preserving and using the existing mansion site. The mansion has an amazing history. So I showed you that earlier picture of Edward Ireland's estate. So we know in the 1790s, Edward Ireland was living there. He had built a Georgian mansion. He was a merchant from Barbados. In the 1830s, he sells his descendants sell the property to the Stewart family. The Stewart family lives essentially lives on the property. They take down the existing mansion, build the Greek Revival building that we see today. It's a very large estate. And gradually, over time, it kind of shrinks. It gets smaller and smaller. You can see kind of the extent of the estate in 1869. You actually have a photograph here of the mansion. You can actually, if you look very carefully, you can actually see people in the photo. This is essentially the mansion site, as well as this detached carriage house. But after the Stewart family, the Stewart family lives in the property. David Stewart actually becomes a U.S. senator for a very short period of time. They live in the property, and then eventually sell the property to a German woolen merchant family, the Demands, who live in the property through the 19th century up into the 1920s, when it sold to Robert Young, a prominent Black musician who lives in the property or uses the property for a short period of time before he in turn sells it to WCAO, which is one of the earliest radio stations. And WCAO actually converts the building into their headquarters. They use the carriage house as kind of their transmitting room, and they put in these giant 165-foot towers, broadcast towers. So they're actually running the programs out of the buildings and broadcasting right from there. We were asked to do the archaeological work to see what was left of any of these histories of this building. You can see in one of our STP units, we encountered one of the foundation bases for this north tower. After WCAO, the building is sold and becomes the Baltimore Institute of Musical Arts, which is essentially a music school for anybody who's been excluded from the Peabody. So essentially in segregation, where Black musicians weren't allowed to be classically trained or couldn't find a school that would allow them to be classically trained. They trained at the Baltimore Institute of Musical Arts. And the Baltimore Institute of Musical Arts benefited greatly because this is right after the war. You have a lot of prominent musicians coming from escaping the Nazis, coming to the United States and helping to teach at the school. And then eventually, after the music school, this building is owned by the city. They renovate it and make it one of their special services buildings. So our goal, document what was still left, what was still present around this building. So in April, we essentially went out last year, went out and tested the yard space, dug STPs and test units, trying to document what was still left in the yard area. We had actually this large parking lot was stripped. They took out the asphalt so we could test where the new building was going. And in the process, we dug several different units, found evidence of all time periods of occupation of this structure, lots of architectural debris from the earlier building and renovations to the current building. And a nice breadth of material culture from 18th century up to the present. So here's just some of the cool different artifacts we recovered, from a possible hat pin to a record, which could have been part of the music school or part of the radio station, a fragment of vinyl record, as well as fragments of colored glass, possibly Tiffany glass. That we know that the mansion was ornate inside. They had Tiffany glass windows, decorative ironwork, marble fireplaces. And so the Upton mansion is just another one of these buildings that we're trying to link together through all of these different projects and tell a larger history of Baltimore, of these different sites within Baltimore. The Upton mansion actually was owned by the Lux family. The property the Upton mansion was built on was owned by the Lux family, who actually owned at one point the iron furnace. So all of these sites, when you start digging into the history, you see in relation of these sites and how the histories are interconnected, and how even individual people have played a hand or lived in these different sites. And by comparing these sites across time, how different people were treated, the material they had, how they lived their life, we get a much fuller picture of Baltimore. And it can also speak to kind of that dichotomy of two Baltimores and why that persists or has persisted through time. So this research is ongoing. This research is not just my research. There's many, many people who have helped make this research possible and who work alongside me. This is just a few of those individuals, but I encourage anybody who's interested in helping us with research in and around Baltimore. You're welcome to contact me at fracchia.umd.edu. And I think I'll be happy to take any questions if you have any questions. Thank you.
All right, so you do have one question in the chat box so far. It says, is there a site where we can follow the research?
Sure. So I have it's the Archaeology of Baltimore website through the University of Maryland. It's in the process of being updated. So I think the Upton Mansion portion has information, but some of the other sites haven't been uploaded yet. Hopefully that will be done in the next couple of weeks. But we've essentially, if you want to know any more about these sites, you're welcome to contact me, or you could look at hopefully this website in a couple of weeks.
Does anyone else have any other questions? You can drop them in the chat box, or you can even unmute if you want to. Last call for questions, anybody?
I have a question.
Yes.
Sure.
If there wasn't a lot of room for privies in some of these little yards, right? Did you ever, were you able to ever discern more than one privy per yard, or were they always cleaned out and then reused, do you think?
I think the general, for some of these properties, which are so, you see how small they are.
Yeah.
You don't really have room to put another privy. In our case, the buildings on Eddy Street, they had privies and they had plumbing. So a lot of that plumbing kind of destroyed what was in the yard space. So I don't know in terms of those properties, if there were multiple privies. We only located one on 1904 and 1906 Eddy Street. And then we might have had a trace of one on 1905, but I think it had been destroyed. So on these properties, I think they were probably mainly cleaned out. So they were, these were made out of brick, about 4 feet in diameter. So fairly substantial. You're probably not going to want to recreate that somewhere else in your yard, nor do you really have room for them. Maybe in a bigger yard, yes, but not in these yards.
Okay, so where do you think they retrashed their trash? I mean, it could have been anywhere then, right? They're basically retrashing their trash.
There was actually a business, so you get what we call night soilmen. So people who come at night because nobody wants to smell this waste, and they collect this waste and they would haul it out. And there was a business of converting this into fertilizer. So there's still fields at North Point and different locations, even in Anne Arundel County, where you find ceramics, you find stuff, essentially this waste that had been caught with this waste that's being used as fertilizer and put all over the fields.
Wow, thank you.
Then we have a question. Have the city's privy hunters help or hurt your research?
So I actually called a privy hunter to help me with 1904 and 1906 Eddy Street. And my goal was to show what material we could recover. So they worked with me. They know what they're doing very well. They were able to help find the privy right away. They helped excavate the privy. I did it stratigraphically. So by every soil layer, I screened, while they were excavating, I screened like a madman, trying to recover all that material. The very end of that, that material was liquid, it was muddy. We weren't able to fully screen all of that. But yeah, they helped out with that. The only problem is in Baltimore, we don't have a robust archaeological laws. We don't have anything protecting almost all these properties at the city level. We have federal and we have state laws. We don't have things at the city level. So if you wanted to go out, you could go to somebody's property, dig their backyard. And these guys, mainly guys, go out and they excavate privies in people's backyards, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, they can do that, but also we lose, since we're not having people systematically study these, we lose a record. And so you could say, well, there's so many 19th century and 20th century buildings out there, but when you start thinking about different contexts of what group lived in this area, and especially even earlier, when you think about the 18th century, there's a very limited number of properties that have that archaeological record. And if you have somebody go in and excavate it or dig it up and collect some, plates and glasses, that's great, but you may never hear about it. Or may hear about a little bit, but then you also lose everything else. So you might lose the fish bone, you might lose seeds, you might lose all of this record that's really going to flesh out someone's life. It's great that people have this interest. We need more systematic study and recovery, and I hope that we could generate more of that and involve these people. Definitely have a very good job, they can find these privies and they're very enthusiastic, involve them. But we need to really do this more systematically and scientifically if we want to tell the complete story of a property. So yeah. It's harms and hurts, or harms, hurts, and sometimes helps.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, well, no other questions have come in. Adam, thank you so much for giving your time and talking with us tonight. That was really fascinating.
Oh, I really appreciate it. I'm sorry if I'm a little incoherent. So I'm in Austria right now, and I think it's about 2 a.m. So.
Oh my gosh.
Really.
Wow, dedication.
All right, well, thank you so much.
The strudel will make up for it tomorrow.
I hope so. I hope so. Thanks.